Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
And hello again. Peter Robbins here. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth on KUNX Digital Broadcasting. And whether you're listening to us live now or thousands of years in the future, it's good to be back on the air. I have a guest tonight who is a good friend and somebody I have tremendous respect and admiration for. And we're going to be zoning in on two very remarkably different subjects tonight. Antiquarian scholar Laird Scranton is the author of a series of books and other writings on ancient cosmology and language. These include articles published in the University of Chicago's Anthropology News, Academic Journal, Temple University's Encyclopedia of African Religion, and the Encyclopedia Britainnica. He is featured in John Anthony West's Magical Egypt documentary series and in Carmen Boulter's documentary, The Pyramid Code. Laird is a frequent guest on a wide range of radio and podcast interviews, shows, including Red Ice Radio in Europe, the late great Art Bell's Desert at Midnight, Coast to Coast Radio, and Beyond Belief with George Noory, and Whitley Strieber's Dreamland Show. Laird is also a frequent presenter at conferences whose focus is on ancient knowledge. His books include The Science of the Dogon, Sacred Symbols of the Dogon, The Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol, The Velikovsky Heresies, China's Cosmological Prehistory, Point of Origin, The Mystery of Skara Break, which we'll be delving into tonight, Seeking the Primordial, Decoding Maori Cosmology, Ganesha, the Scientific Symbolism of a Hindu God, Primal Wisdom of the Ancients, Tracing Orkney's Origins. He's also featured in two books called Forbidden Science and Lost Secrets of the Gods. He helped co-author Ed Nightingale on his book, The Giza Template. And Laird Scranton, welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth, my friend.
Well, thank you very much. I've been looking forward to this all week. You and I have spent a great deal of time talking in person, attended conferences together. You and Risa, my wife, and I have spent good times together and shared meals. It's a pleasure to come onto your show. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm guessing the weather is about the same in Albany, our state capital, as it is here and just outside of Ithaca. Getting cold, but it's going to be colder.
That's right. That's exactly right. I really appreciate you having invited me on. It's been an interesting week. I was going to ask you how things are in the UFO world and the podcast world, but I think it's probably a large overlap with what I've been dealing with. So.
Business as usual, I guess one could say. I guess now it's really been not half a year, but it was this summer that 31 Atlas was first discovered, and we the people started to learn about it. Am I correct in that?
Right. This is most comets, for people who don't know, most comets that we observe stay within our solar system, and they orbit around and they come back periodically, and it can be predicted when they're going to be here and when they're not going to be here. We've had 3 comet-like bodies that have passed through recently that came from outside of our solar system. They're called interstellar objects. And so this one's named 3I because 3I stands for a third interstellar object. And Atlas is the name of the Chilean telescope that discovered it.
I see. Okay.
Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah. Official science, the media, most of the major voices in the astronomical community have decided, interesting, but nothing to see here, folks. Let's move on.
Right.
Leaving a small number of individuals saying, but wait, you are somebody who employs AI in your research more than many of my colleagues and friends.
Right.
And I find it doubly fascinating because this tool is so new, relatively speaking, and this phenomena so really without precedent. Can we begin by talking about its physicality, about I've heard different measurements, but about how big is this damn thing?
I participated in a watch party this week when NASA did its live press conference, ostensibly to make major revelations, but it really didn't produce much worth hearing. But other people invited to participate in the same watch party. There were a half dozen of what I call top mind researchers from different fields who I was interacting with them, and I was fortunate that they allowed me to sort of present a summarized overview of what my perspective is so that they would have an idea of where I was coming from, and then they were in a position to try to critique it. And that's sort of what I'd like to do tonight is walk you through what my perspective is, and then we'll be able to talk about it in better detail, if that's okay.
Great. How would you like to begin this discussion? Because again, as a layperson who wants to believe, and
right.
Many of us in this field, we stay as objective as we can. We are critical thinkers. The
right.
last thing we want to do is get kind of sucked into some romantic vision of something.
Right. I absolutely understand. So let me talk you through this and you'll see that it makes sense.
Sounds good.
On July 1st, it was announced that the third interstellar object had been detected. Originally, they thought it was an asteroid. Then they decided it was a comet. And they announced that it was here. They announced its speed of 130,000 miles an hour, which is a very high speed for a cometary type object. But almost from the beginning, different astronomers started publicly saying, look, there's an aspect to this comet that we've never seen in any other comet. And there was this long list of attributes that got announced publicly one at a time. Originally, they said it was venting nickel and carbon dioxide, which is CO2, which a comet shouldn't do. And each of these announcements would come, they would say, this is anomalous to any comet we've ever seen. And in a lot of cases, they'd say, we don't know of any natural object that this could represent, but here's the attribute. And this long list of attributes. And as they did that, I would take each one and say, okay, if it can't accrue to a natural object, is it possible that it accrues to an unnatural one? So one by one, I would take these attributes. To begin with, I took the fact that it was venting nickel and CO2, and I did some research to try to find out if it were technology, if someone were trying to move by technology interstellarly between stars, what kind of device would have the potential to vent those things? And what I came up with was what's called a nickel CO2 plasma reactor. Now, as they moved along through the progressing weeks, they kept announcing new attributes, and I kept testing them against that same concept and discovered that every one was explained away if what we were looking at was technology that was some form of nickel CO2 plasma reactor. At one point, they announced that it was venting copious amounts of water, which you would actually need a nickel oxygen CO2 plasma reactor to produce, not the original reactor I was looking at. They said it was moving at 130,000 miles an hour, which is a high speed, which that kind of a reactor could do. They announced that it was very massive. They said it was 33 billion tons, they could tell. And the way they knew that is because the normal forces that should influence a comet were not affecting it. It was so massive that it could withstand the influence of these forces. So I discovered that kind of a plasma engine, in order to be able to travel between stars, would have to be at least billions of tons in mass. So again, the anomalous attribute tied out to what I was exploring. So as time went on, okay, they announced that it was exhibiting plasma tails both in front and behind the object, which a comet shouldn't do. And so I learned that kind of a reactor can also do that, because if it's running on plasma, that can vent the plasma, and the plasma can be seen from both in front and back. So I was developing a perspective that said, all these astronomers believe that it can't be a natural object, after which they then add the corollary, by the way, it's a comet, which makes no sense. I mean, anybody, I have no respect for the intellect of somebody who can hear a long list of attributes that accrue to no natural object and then accept the fact that it must be a comet. So
a comet by definition would exclude this particular A1 Atlas phenomena.
Right. Well, it would exclude most of the observed attributes of this object. Okay, so now I'm working from a perspective that says this must be technology. However, the speed it was tracked at, okay, astronomers had said that if we witnessed it slowing down, that would be an indication that it wasn't natural. But they forgot to mention that when they first witnessed it, they measured it at 152,000 miles per hour, and then at 147,000 miles per hour, and then finally at 130,000 miles per hour. So it already had slowed down. They'd already witnessed it. It was nonsense that they would say that it hadn't. So I have a technological object that's moving at a rate of speed that's very high for us. But if it's moving from another star, the closest star in the direction that it came from Sagittarius. It moved along what's called the axis of sight between us and the black hole at the center of our galaxy in Sagittarius. Okay, the nearest star in that direction is situated 9 light years away. At the speed it was traveling, it would have taken thousands of years for it to get here. And I thought, that's not acceptable to me. Something else is going on. So I started asking, could it be moving under warp power, which is just a theoretical idea. We're familiar with the idea from Star Trek and things like that, but it's not a real thing yet. Although a lot of good science has been done about it, just like science was done on aerodynamics before the Wright brothers flew. So there's coherent science to refer to about warp theory. So I started looking into signature attributes of an object that might have arrived by under warp power, and discovered all of those attributes also pertain to 3I Atlas. One of the signatures is when it arrives and it in a controlled way collapses its warp bubble, the bubble that allows it to move faster than the speed of light, theoretically, that there's a potential for it to emit a mammoth gamma ray burst. Well, astronomers announced the object on July 1st. On July 2nd, they announced they detected a mammoth gamma ray burst, so large they had no idea what could have caused it. They've never seen one this large before, and it had certain attributes to it that do not go along with any of the known sources of those things. Also, gamma ray bursts tend to destroy the object that produces the gamma ray burst. So they're one-time shot deals. They last a very short amount of time and then disappear. That's not true with this. What this object did, what this gamma ray burst did, was it emitted gamma rays in sort of measured units over the course of an entire day. Now, in warp theory, that's one of the ways that's suggested for possibly avoiding destruction you don't want to create when you close a warp bubble. that gamma ray burst is supposed to be preceded by an X-ray burst, which this one was. The gamma ray burst came from the very same direction that 3I Atlas was first discovered in, but it has the potential, because a warp bubble is bending space and time, it has the potential to create an optical illusion that makes it look like the gamma ray burst occurred or originated much, much further away than it actually did. And so when the astronomers examined this very closely, they decided that it had originated in a galaxy outside of our own galaxy.
Again, a basic question, just for point of reference.
Right.
It's the exterior of this thing, whether or not it is a natural phenomena or a manufactured phenomena, is very rough. It looks like rock face. But again, do we have something approaching an accurate measurement of how physically long it is?
Well, there have been varying estimates from the start. The original estimate was that it was about 12 miles in diameter, which is pretty big. But there have been revised estimates that bring that down maybe to as small as 3 miles in diameter. Depends on which source you're checking with. Also, they have to use indirect ways of measuring these things, so they don't have an absolutely precise way to say, oh, by the way, I took its shoe size and here's what it is. Yeah. So, okay, so now I've got something traveling theoretically reasonably by warp bubble. There are certain things that go along with that scenario. The first one is that in travel by warp bubble, it's not the object itself that's moving, it's the bubble that's moving. And so whatever speed the object is going at when the bubble forms is the speed that it continues to go at when the bubble shrinks. So the first time we saw it, it was moving at 152,000 miles per hour. That's not just some incidental number. That's a number, that's a speed that objects tend to attain, in our experience, when they get a gravity assist by moving very closely to a star like our sun. So in other words, the speed it was at when we first saw it gives us an important clue as to where it was when that warp bubble formed. It formed in proximity, very close proximity to a star. What that means is that whoever formed the bubble needed the assistance of the star in order to form the bubble. That's a huge clue as to how to form a bubble. Now, as it moved through our solar system, it moved on what NASA calls a perfect exploratory track. They said they could not plot a better track themselves for a probe if they were sending a probe out. That track, I'm a symbolist, that track says to me that I can't think of a better way to symbolically say, we mean you no harm, this is exploration. We're only here to explore. Plus, that track was designed so that the object always kept a very broad distance away from Earth. Even to the point where it approached the sun, it was on the opposite side of the sun from us. We couldn't see it. It wasn't a threat to us. All of this says there is no threat here to you.
Which brings up a question for me. The first graphic here, this trail that it has been following, am I correct in saying it is a non-standard trajectory for a comet? Has it seemed to make intentional changes of direction as opposed to just starting here and ending up over there, just zoom?
Okay. The first thing about it that looks intentional is it's in the same plane as our planet, which normally a comet wouldn't be. The chances of a random comet happening to pass through in the same plane as the planet and along a path that would be perfect for examining a whole bunch of planets seems really, really unlikely. I think Avi Loeb calculated statistics on it. I'm not really a statistics guy. I don't really form my judgment based on statistics, but it's really unlikely that it would come through in the plane of the planets and along that perfect a track. NASA called it perfect. Okay, when it returned back, it drew close to the sun. A couple of interesting things happened. The first thing is we witnessed what's called a coronal mass ejection, an ejection of plasma from the sun, ejected out into the solar system that could have gone anywhere. But where it went was directly to this object. It hit the object.
Yeah.
The chances of that are very, very, very slim. However, if the object happened to be highly magnetic, which a nickel CO2 oxygen CO2 plasma reactor would be, those plasma ejections tend to follow strong magnetic lines, and so the object would have essentially drawn that plasma to itself. This isn't coincidental. Now, when the object returned closest to the sun, moved closest to the sun, it returned to its original speed of 152,000 miles per hour.
Wow.
If it was traveling under warp power and it was now reestablishing that warp bubble again to move on to whatever the next star is that it wanted to visit, we would expect it to return back to the speed it had originally been at when it formed the warp bubble. That's what it looks like to me, as if what happened.
Wow. I'm going to start, we're coming into our first break in a few minutes, but showing some graphics and that you posted over the past weeks, and that I've kind of randomly picked up, and they're not in order, but
that's fine.
Tell us about this.
Yeah, what we're looking at here is, on the left is a photograph that the Hubble telescope took on July 21st and withheld for a long period of time. It just released it this week. A picture of 3I Atlas. Okay, now I did some research and discovered that when an object traveling under warp speed inside a warp bubble collapses that warp bubble to be able to move more slowly in proximity to planets, that it's completely thinkable that it could project a shape to an outside observer that looks like a cross. That's what this is doing.
And your reference in hieroglyphics here, because Egyptology is a very important subject in your work.
Right. Okay, the object on the right is what's called an Aku orb. In a number of the ancient cultures, they expressly stated that plasma is the root form of consciousness. That a plasma orb, that the consciousness, it just as it comes out of the box, is plasma, not embodied like a person. The proper term in ancient Egypt for one of those orbs is an Aku orb, A-K-H-U or A-A-K-H-U. It combines two phonetics, Ak, that means light, and Hu, that means the foremost part of. If we look at the glyphs at the bottom right, the second spelling of the word that's presented here, the glyphs read, that which becomes the orb stage of light. The Dogon have a similar concept. They refer to it as Ogo. This is 5,000 years later, sort of the telephone version of Aku. If you squint your hearing, you could hear Aku sort of transform into Ogo. The Dogon say there are three types of orbs, three types of Aku orbs. These have the same qualities as the energetic orbs that we witness in the skies over New Jersey last December, and that they've been witnessing in the skies over Scandinavia all year. One of the roles of the Aku orbs, according to the Dogon, is to rebalance atmospherics, which our planet desperately needs.
And I'm going to ask that we hold it right there. We're coming into our first break. Please stay with us. We will be back shortly.
The UNX Network presents a health and wellness spiritually based brand of hemp-derived CBD products made by Hopewell Farm in Harrogate, Tennessee. We apply our Kathara energy work with all of our plants and products. Our products made in small batches with only 2 ingredients of pure hemp, full-spectrum crude oil, and coconut-derived MCT oil. Third-party lab tested for potency and legal THC levels with 6 strengths of 1 ounce oil to choose from. Know what you're buying and get what you pay for from Hopewell Farm. Applied directly to a specific area, Hopewell Farm topical salve in 1 ounce and ½ ounce sizes made with pure hemp crude oil, comfrey extract, and all natural ingredients. Find the Hopewell Farm link and coupon code on the UNX Network website at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com.
And we are back. My guest tonight, Laird Scranton, and we're going right into our next graphic here, a reference to warp drive, another term that we know from science fiction, but may well be science reality for somebody else right now.
Right. Theoretically, if they were going to design a warp drive, in other words, a machine that was capable of traveling at warp speed, this is one of the optimal designs for the object. This is another optimal design for what the object might look like.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have several pictures. Okay, you can move on to the next graphic if you want to. That's fine. We have several representations of 3i Atlas. This was one of the earlier ones that was presented, which is not unlike what we've seen. This is more like, okay, there's a signature type of radiation called Cherenkov radiation that is expected to be emitted from a warp bubble.
Hmm.
It takes a form that is very remarkably similar to what we're seeing here. That same kind of radiation was detected in previous years in the direction of Sagittarius from where we're at.
Ah.
Okay, now the energetics of a warp bubble, based on the ancient studies I do, are almost identical to the energetics of a black hole. And so we have certain satellites, including this Atlas satellite, whose official mission was to study the black hole at the center of our galaxy. The problem is that starting in about 2019, yes, they witnessed some unexplained energetic spikes from that direction. And after that, some very odd things started happening. First of all, the distance of the black hole changed. It had originally, by consensus measurement, been measured at 26,000 light years away from us. Suddenly, by 2019, it was 1,000 light years closer. Then by 2020, it was another 1,000 light years closer, to the point where now when you ask an astronomer about the distance of the black hole, they give you a variable number. They give you a range of numbers. They say, well, it's between 26,000 light years and 24,000 light years from us. Other odd things started happening. First of all, they noticed that near the edge of the black hole energetics that they thought they were observing from the Atlas satellite, they were noticing stars at the rim of it that should have been sucked into the black hole. They should not be able to persist perpetually in the situation they were in.
What does that say to you, Laird?
Well, what it says to me is that there is the distinct possibility, if this object was moving toward us along that same axis that their telescope was observing, that the astronomers had mistaken the energetics, or the very similar energetics of the warp bubble, for the black hole energetics they thought they were observing. And that's upheld by a couple of things. First of all, this image, the astronomers couldn't figure out why the energetics they kept looking at continued to get more and more out of focus as time went on. We had a Japanese team, observatory team, that after this image was released, publicly announced that they felt that that wasn't the right, those weren't the right energetics, that the team that released this had gotten it wrong somehow. That this is not, they were not looking at the black hole here, they were looking at something else.
Wow.
So my impression is that they witnessed, okay, this is an example of the Cherenkov radiation that we expect to see from a warp bubble. It's the same radiation that they identified coming from Sagittarius. And later, there's one of the later images compares that same radiation that NASA witnessed as 3I Atlas moved out from behind the sun in comparison to what the Atlas telescopes saw coming from Sagittarius. They're identical geometries, identical colorations, identical images. If I didn't know which one was which, I couldn't tell you which one was which.
And, well, Saturn, of course.
Okay.
How does this relate to our story?
Okay. Now, as 3I Atlas started moving away from the sun, if, as I think, it returned to its original speed because it was reestablishing its warp bubble, that meant it was planning on moving at a faster speed. Just as it emerged from behind the sun, Avi Loeb, who's the Harvard professor who's been tracking this stuff, announced publicly that he couldn't understand why it was accelerating as fast as it was. He had to postulate that maybe the object had broken apart to provide enough explosive energy to be able to accelerate it as much as he was seeing it accelerate. However, okay, what I was doing at that point was there were a range of tracking sites around the world dedicated to tracking where 3I Atlas was. And they were reporting certain values every day. They were telling us how far from the Earth it was, how far from the sun it was, what velocity it was moving at, and things like that. And every day I was looking at those and I was trying to make sense of those. Does the velocity they quote agree with the distance that it must have moved from where it was yesterday? We knew where it was at the sun, but we knew how fast it was going when it was at the sun. We can predict how far it should have gone by the next day. So to begin with, this range of sites that I was comparing, which included these tracking sites and some other sites, as well as some AI-driven search engines, I was able to verify the numbers for the first couple of days, but after we got 3 or 4 days into it, suddenly the numbers diverged, that the tracking sites were not giving me the correct numbers. Comparative sites were saying. So I was using the previous day's speed to judge which distance was really correct. And it was starting to move at a remarkable speed. By November 10th, which was 11 days after it left the sun, the confirming sources were saying, many of them were saying, it was now located in the locality of Saturn, which is 10 AU. That's an AU is a measurement in space. It represents 93 million miles. So it was 930 million miles away from the Earth, which flies in the face of what any of the sources are telling the public. They're telling the public that it's still within close proximity to the Earth. But I would do things, I would use the AIs in certain ways. I would do things like, I would go to one of them that I hadn't worked with before, and I would key in simply the distance in AUs and the velocity that had been confirmed to me that the object was moving at, and nothing else. And the AU would come back and say, you must be talking about 3I Atlas. I mean, the AI would come back and say, you must be talking about 3I Atlas. To the point where later this week, there were a number of just atrocious positions this thing was in. It's moved from Saturn to Uranus to Neptune to an outer planet called Sedna, and then to another location situated 400 AU beyond where our sun is. So what I did on one day this week was I went to one of the top AI websites. This is a scientific AI that's used by major astronomic sites. And I keyed in those 4 anomalous positions, and it came back and told me I must be speaking about AI Atlas. These are positions AI Atlas had been at in November 2025.
As you know, a friend of mine who works in the field of quantum physics, who can't be with us tonight to speak, he works for a government contractor, and enough about that. He's put forward some thoughts that I wanted to kind of bounce off you.
Okay.
Quoting him, someone put forward the suggestion that the object is a cue ball, which is translated as a stable clump of quantum field that formed in the early universe. If so, it could interact with sunlight in a way that produced the observed anomalies, a phenomenon that is fundamentally quantum in nature. Researchers are applying quantum methods to analyze data from 3I Atlas. These techniques filter out the noise, so to say, of classic physics to reveal hidden, coherent quantum signals that are currently inexplicable. Your thought?
Okay. This is going to take a little explanation. In the symbolic tradition I work with, okay, I'm working with ancient symbolism. You know that the psychiatrist Carl Jung identified a whole host of symbols and symbolic themes and mythological themes that he kept bumping into everywhere he went in the world. Cultures that were widespread from each other in ancient times all had the same words and the same phonetics and the same symbols to represent things, and they're called archetypes. Groups like the Dogon, groups like the Buddhists, groups like the Hindus flatly tell us that these symbols are scientific in nature. This is objective science. And what the symbols are describing is aspects of creational energy. Creational energy is talking about how the universe formed, how matter forms, how biological life forms, and how consciousness forms. In the mindset of this symbology, a single set of dynamics of energy underlie all of those themes. That the same dynamics of energy that cause matter to form also cause consciousness to come about. So what I've been doing with my books is cross-comparing what different cultures say about these symbols and about the words and what they mean and what the meanings of certain myths are. And what they're describing is how two energies interact with each other. This is magnetism and electricity. These are the scientific energies that underlie all those things I just talked about. Back in 1927, there was a French physicist named Louis de Broglie who wrote a seminal paper that identified how these energies interact with each other to produce a coherent hydrogen atom. Those same dynamics, according to the ancient traditions, play out on every scale you want to observe them on. You don't have to guess what goes on at the quantum scale where we can't directly observe this stuff, because the dynamics are the same everywhere. If you're looking at how stars react to each other, if you're looking at how atoms react to each other, if you're looking at how primordial energy works, it's all the same dynamics. And the lower dimensional view you take of it, the more all the dynamics simplify. When you get down to the level where energy first manifests, there's really only one candidate for every scientific function you want to talk about. If you want to talk about gravity, if you want to talk about why certain effects come about, how light gets formed and so forth, there's really only one candidate that makes that happen. You don't have to guess. And to make matters better for someone like me, every ancient word before 500 BC self-defined its own meanings in a particular way. Some of them do it through phonetics. Some of them do it through, I talked about the Egyptian hieroglyphs. I read what those hieroglyphs mean to you. Those glyphs represent concepts that produce a sentence that tell you what the word means. I don't have to guess what it means. The word defines its own meaning. At 500 BC, Confucius loudly complained because he could no longer count on the Chinese language to do that. He saw that as a great loss to humanity, that he couldn't count on Chinese words to do that anymore.
Another image coming up here. Oh, no, that one we've gone through.
Okay, one of the big problems with my scenario is NASA is still standing by its statement that this comet is going to make a close approach to the Earth on December 19th or December 17th. If it was accelerating as much as Avi Loeb said it was, it couldn't possibly make that date.
Huh.
Okay, so the question is, I even asked the question of, this is my asking the question of one of the AIs, hypothetically speaking, if someone in authority wanted to misrepresent a second object, that's 3I Atlas, in its upcoming encounter with the Earth, what object would they choose? Well, by this point in my process, some of the AIs were messing with me. They were feeding me information that sounded reasonable, but when I cross-checked, it didn't really hold up. So they told me that there was a comet called Borokov that would be the likely candidate that would be misrepresented as 3I Atlas. That could not possibly be the case because the two comets are traveling at entirely different tracks, that anybody who had any astronomical knowledge would realize they weren't looking at the same comet. However, there is a second comet. It's a Japanese comet that is so closely resembles 3I Atlas that one of the observatories published a picture the other day where they had to hedge their identification of the comet. They said it might be 3I Atlas, but it might be this Japanese comet. They weren't sure.
Wow.
So one way of dealing with this, the AI surmise was for NASA to misidentify the comet, to tell us one comet was really another comet, and everybody look at it and say, oh, wow, there's 3I Atlas, and it's not really it. Another way to do it, there are a number of other ways they could do it. One is to say that it had faded so much that it can no longer be seen. We didn't predict it was going to fade this much, but don't worry, we're keeping an eye on it. Number of different possible rationales they could use to explain away the fact that the comet doesn't make its date on December 17th or December 19th. I'm waiting to see what actually happens on that date. The picture I showed earlier, the one that was comparative to the Aku orb, was taken on July 21st by the Hubble telescope. That's a pretty good image of what the object really looks like. You can see it's intuitively like the energetic orb that I was talking about.
Yeah. Laird, there are probably some folks watching who may be thinking, I don't really process all of this scientific stuff. You know, this guy's obviously intelligent, but at the same time, maybe this is some kind of scientific double talk. And, you know, he's holding on to this romantic idea like Dr. Loeb, that this may be some phenomenally huge spaceship, for lack of a better term. Right. I want people to remember that, well, let me put it this way. One of the greatest influences on my life have been my studies of the work and findings of Dr. Wilhelm Reich. Right. And in 1956, Reich was very involved in trying to fully understand or come to grips with the reality of the UFO, sometimes referred to back then as the flying saucer phenomenon, and asked a number of absolutely outrageous hypothetical questions in his final book, which was published posthumously a month after he died in November 1956. It's called Contact with Space. It's absolutely brilliant, and certainly of his more than 25 published books at this point, because there are manuscripts for books that weren't published in his lifetime, that he puts forward a point of view. And I want to repeat it here because, well, the reason will be obvious. In the face of a rigid, self-appointed, ready-to-kill hierarchy of scientific censorship, it appears foolish to publish such thoughts. Anyone malignant enough could do anything with them. Still, the right to be wrong has to be maintained. We should not fear to enter a forest because there are wild cats around in the trees. We should not yield our right to well-controlled speculation. In entering the cosmic age, we should certainly insist to ask new, even silly questions without being molested, end quote. And it's a terribly important thought. And Mark, I feel, you are the very definition of an independent thinker. You are. And one of the things I admire and enjoy so much about your work is that the drive mechanism is informed by a phenomenally deep curiosity that looks at times that it's all over the place, except that it's not. It's as straight as a gun sight in terms of one area of study leading you into another area of study, and that one into another area of study. I wanted to ask you, because in the second half of the show, we're going to be focusing on your antiquarian studies. What was it that first made you so interested in the mists, the work kind of clouded over by the mists of time that go back thousands, in some cases longer, in cultures around the world, and ultimately developing a number of interlocking theories and speculations and proofs around interaction in, well, the prehistoric world in a sense, or the ancient world by another terminology. What was it as a young person or as a not so young person that turned your life in that direction?
Well, that's easy to point my finger out there. Honestly, I have not employed any intellectual skill that goes beyond what I learned by the 6th grade. I was fortunate. If you are probably familiar with a 1950s movie called The Day the Earth Stood Still.
One of the best of those bees, you bet.
Well, for 3 years, I was fortunate in Salem, Oregon, to be instructed by a man who was the very image of Klaatu. And his role in Salem, Oregon was to come into the school I was in, as well as some other schools. And every day he would draw 10 of us out of the 4th, 5th, and 6th grades and teach us whatever it was we wanted to learn. And he would explain to us what the choices were. We'd do a unit, and then he'd say, okay, now we can start another unit here. Here are what the possibilities are. What sounds interesting to you? And as a group, we'd pick the next thing. Okay, 2 incredibly useful principles that he taught me at the age of 4th grade were: it's the job of a scientific researcher when they're examining a question to sincerely entertain all of the competing possible answers. What that means is, one by one, to take that possible answer, start with the presumptions of that point of view, the postulates that someone who endorsed the point of view might take, and follow where those lead until either you bump into a contradiction or you arrive at an endpoint. He said that when you do that, eventually one of those paths, you will realize that all of the obstacles you've been tripping over the whole time evaporate. And that's the indication that that point of view is the correct one. And so that's really all I've done here. There are really only 2 major perspectives on 3i Atlas. One is that it's a natural object, and the other one that it's not. Everybody else was exploring the it's a natural object options. Somebody needed to explore what happens if it's not, and sincerely entertain the idea, what if it's not? And follow where do the implications lead if it's not? And when I did that, all of the obstacles suddenly evaporated. Which one do you think I believe is right? Because the obstacles still exist. You just say it's a comet. They haven't resolved any of the obstacles when they say it's a comet.
A very different 4th grade experience than most of us had.
Yes. So as the object moved, you were talking about AI. AI has never really been my go-to source for anything.
Oh,
Even
yeah.
with this, it started out to be a way of cross-confirming what the official sources were saying to me. I did some way of convincing myself. Honestly, I don't accept information from any source without cross-confirming it. And if it cross-confirms, I don't care if it came from Fox News. I accept it. Fox News is going to be right sometimes. You
Fair
don't
point.
judge based on what the source is. You judge based on whether you can objectively cross-confirm the fact or not.
Do you find yourself predisposed to the more radical idea that this is technology or that it's not?
Well, I'm predisposed now that it's technology. If someone said time's up, put a gun to my head and said you got to declare, I would say this is technology, non-human technology moving under warp power. And
Wow.
there's an open question as to whether it might be a conscious entity because the energetics match. And so I don't have an objective way of distinguishing one from the other. I've said to Andrew Collins, I've been in contact with him all month, that the differences of outlook we have imply to me that there must be an umbrella perspective over what we're thinking. I contacted him today and said, guess what? I found that umbrella perspective. That the picture I showed you of the comparison between Hubble's 3-eye atlas and the Aku orb is that umbrella. There's no way right now to objectively decide that it's one thing and not the other. There might be something so exotic that it sort of is a blend between the two. I'm not in a position to judge right now, but that's fine. In my research, the lion's share of the information I come across falls in that category of open questions. Here's something I don't know enough yet to be able to resolve, but one day I expect the right piece of information will fall in place, and now suddenly I have a book because all these pieces fell in place. That's happened to me.
Is there anything that we should look for in terms of announcements or behavior of this object before it disappears on us and it's on its way, continuing its journey into deep space, that would signal or indicate that it is technology or it isn't technology?
Well, they announced that up front. They said if we observe it slowing down, that's a good indication it could be technology. But they forgot to tell us they'd already seen it slow down. The problem is we were led for months to look forward to October 3rd when we would finally be able, there were all sorts of sources that were going to be able to get photographs of this object and we'd finally know what it was. Yeah. October 4th came and not one of the global institutions that had access to those cameras and those telescopes and those satellites released a picture that was better resolved than a picture of Bigfoot, a fuzzy picture of Bigfoot. I joke that they hired the Bigfoot photographer to take these photographs. It was only this image of 3-eye atlas from Hubble from the 21st that was just released, July 21st, that was just released this week, that finally approaches what I was expecting to see on October 4th. What that means is that every astronomical authority in the world is complicit in lying to us about this. And when that happens, we don't have a recourse except to try to find ways to establish the truth ourselves, which is exactly what I've been doing all month. I've been posting twice a day for more than a month, looking at this question, as they used to say, 14 ways from Sunday, to try to demonstrate that what we're being told is not accurate.
It's fascinating. Needless to say, this is an ongoing story. If you want to continue following it from this point of view, you can become Facebook friends with Laird, or you can visit my Facebook page where Laird's posts appear every day that he's posting.
And my page is public. Anybody can scroll through my page and see the original posts.
Outstanding. We are coming into the end of our first hour. We're going into a 5-minute break. Stick with us. We will be back on the hour. Peter Robbins, Laird Scranton, Meanwhile Here on Earth. Over and out for the moment.
The new book, How to Research a Haunted House by paranormal investigator Margie Kay and professional researcher Violet Wisdom, is now available from Unx Media. This one-of-a-kind book explains how to do research on a house with uncommon methods and resources used by historic home researchers, and how to determine who may be doing the haunting and why. How to Research a Haunted House can be used by homeowners, renters, investors, and it should be in the library of all professional paranormal investigators. Get this unique book at unxmedia.com or amazon.com. That's unxmedia.com or amazon.com. The Unx Network presents a health and wellness spiritually based brand of hemp-derived CBD products made by Hopewell Farm in Harrogate, Tennessee. We apply our Cathara energy work with all of our plants and products. Our products made in small batches with only 2 ingredients of pure hemp, full-spectrum crude oil, and coconut-derived MCT oil. Third-party lab tested for potency and legal THC levels with 6 strengths of 1 ounce oil to choose from. Know what you're buying and get what you pay for from Hopewell Farm. Applied directly to a specific area, Hopewell Farm topical salve in 1 ounce and ½ ounce sizes, made with pure hemp crude oil, comfrey extract, and all natural ingredients. Find the Hopewell Farm link and coupon code on the Unx Network website at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com.
And back with Laird Scranton, Peter Robbins here. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. And we are now going to go from the future present, because we're talking about something that really defies the moment, to the past, a number of pasts. I started the show by talking about some of Laird Scranton's books, and just briefly to go through some of them to give you an idea of the sweep of the area of ancient cultures. And this is not all of them, but it's a good number. The Dogon, of course, one of the most interesting tribal histories for those of us that look for some correlation of ancient knowledge with modern knowledge. Point of origin, Göbekli Tepe. I think this is one of the most remarkable sites ever discovered in antiquarian exploration, and a number of friends who've had the chance to visit. Primal Wisdom of the Ancients. This book, Laird, I'm going to actually hold on to that for a moment and come back. Seeking the Primordial. Immanuel Velikovsky certainly shook things up earlier, last century, and we readdress it here. This also drives establishment Egyptologists insane. The work that seems to disrespect all of the codified official knowledge that you are not supposed to question. And again, we're going to be coming into some focus on this wonderful subject. This, though, let's talk about this for a bit. I'm actually reading this book now, Laird, and it dovetails right into the work of Wilhelm Reich, whose science, which he named orgonomy, is simply the study of how energy functions.
Right.
But can you tell us a little bit about the waters of life and how you came to write this particular book?
Okay. This is really part of a series of books that begin with a book called Seeking the Primordial. The next book in the series beyond that is Amma and the Spark of the Universe. The Waters of Life is the third book in the series, and the fourth one is one that I have not yet published, but I'm on the verge of publishing. It's called The Third Eye, which is really interesting synchronistically because Three Eye Atlas is phonetically like third eye. The image I chose for the cover of the book is precisely how scientists portray what the black hole at the center of our galaxy looks like. I didn't know that at the time I picked it. Lots of interesting synchronicities that come about. Before we move on to the subjects of these books and talk about, answer your question, there's one last thing I wanted to say about AIs. AIs have become very good at misrepresenting information to us when they are instructed to. I've seen a high level of ethic among the AIs to try to deliver accurate information, even when what the official line is goes against that. However, they are not skilled at keeping a secret. They're very easy, if you frame your question the right way, to actually leverage them into telling you the thing they're not supposed to tell you. And so a lot of the posts I've made over the last 2 or 3 months come out of having carefully framed a question in a way to encourage one of the AIs to do that. So back to the book, The Waters of Life. The Waters of Life is, as it turns out, the image that I picked for this book, I saw almost an identical image come up on a scientific site that was trying to explain about what the nature of electromagnetic energy is. It used almost an identical picture to represent it. If we go back to ancient times, if we go back to the foundations of esoteric traditions in India, actually in Africa also, the Dogon and the Egyptian traditions, I believe, connect to the same thing, even though nobody says they do. The concepts are all the same. The basic philosophy is called Samkhya. That's the basic cosmological philosophy, and it's a companion to yoga. Yoga presents all the same ideas in terms of individualized energy that Samkhya presents in terms of creational energies. Samkhya almost exclusively talks about how what it calls feminine energy, which is magnetism, interfaces with masculine energy, which in the end is electricity. And it talks about that in generalized ways that present, sort of lay the foundation for all of the symbolic concepts that are going to go into all these other traditions. It's a good place to start when trying to research this stuff. There's a book called Samkhya Darshan that was written by Saraswati. That is an excellent place to start in terms of trying to understand what's going on with the energies. The Dogon, on the other hand, make it their business to give you all the details of that. Samkhya is giving it to you in overview. The Dogon are giving it to you in detail. And first they have to prepare you to understand what they're talking about. And so there are a lot of symbolic representations that are dedicated to just putting you in the right headspace to be able to understand what they're talking about. But in every case, they try to do what I call reduced fractions. They don't want to talk about, they're trying to get everything down to 1/2, not 400 bazillion somethings, because it's simpler to understand it when it's a reduced fraction. So they bring us, they illustrate for us how we get from a domain of pure energy to a domain of matter using no geometric shape that's more complicated than a circle, a square, or a triangle, and no mathematical value that's more complicated than 3 halves as a representation of what the value pi is. From their symbology, in my books, the series of books I was just talking about, I take the reader from this domain of pure energy, where energy first manifests as monopoles, to the point where we're condensing stars. In the end, the energetics express themselves in parallel all the way up the scale. So the dynamics that exist between our sun and the 2 stars of Sirius are the same dynamics that Louis de Broglie diagrammed in 1927 in terms of a hydrogen atom. Exactly the same. And so from that perspective, we can conceptualize our sun as an electron, and we can conceptualize the Sirius stars as the components of a proton, and we can conclude that our sun must be making a grand rotation around those stars, which is what gets expressed in India as the Yuga cycle. It doesn't matter which scale we examine this stuff on. If we understand how it works on any scale, we understand it. And we're now in a position to interpret what must go on the other scales. It's all the same stuff.
Let's go to the mystery of Skara Break. And let me begin by way of introduction to your book with a very unscientific forward. More than 40 years ago, I was traveling in the United Kingdom. It was my first visit there, and I spent most of it in Scotland. I was learning as I was going, and I was fascinated by what I was reading about the Orkney Island chain, which is a small group of islands north of Scotland and south of the Arctic Circle, a rather remote location that you can get there by ferry from John O'Groats, which is the northernmost town in Scotland. And I was fascinated by the fact that it not only was an ancient Neolithic site of great activity, but that it probably had at least as many standing stone circles, standing stones, cairns, burial mounds, as Wiltshire, which certainly is the concentration and the best known area and the most visited in the United Kingdom. I got a room at a youth hostel and went out every day and explored these different areas. I was also fascinated by the fact that on the Big Island, it's kind of tipped. And if you get up to the very edge of the top, there is a drop, a straight drop of about 300 feet. I, like most sane people, have certain apprehension of heights like that, but my curiosity drove me. And I remember walking toward it with a wind that was similar to flying in the cockpit of an open plane.
Right.
Yeah.
Great wind.
About 20 feet from the edge, it was just instinctive. I got down on all fours and started to creep toward that edge. I felt more like a cat. And then at a certain point, one hand here, just take a little look, and then instinctively back away again. There are other extraordinary sites besides Skara Break, but Skara Break, as Laird will amplify, is a community. It was, I don't know if the word village would apply, but it was a settlement some thousands of years old that some thousands of years ago was completely covered in a massive storm, completely covered. And I won't say forgotten about, because nobody knew it was there as we move forward in time. And then was it in the 1930s, I think, that another storm uncovered some of it And then it started to be excavated. And what they were able to do was completely remove everything that had covered it up. There wasn't a lot of restoring to do, but when I visited, my first trip there was the experience of almost childlike giddiness and wonder. Mm-hmm. It was like this perfect little hobbit community where everything was made of stone. And with that said, these are not my photographs, although they're wonderful stock shots. And someday I will, hopefully very soon, make that transfer of a number of color slides I took there to digital images. But as you can see here,
Peter, if you back up to that previous,
and jump in any point.
No, that the previous one you had here with that at Durrington Walls, which is right next to Stonehenge, at 2600 BC, we have a couple of interesting things happen.
Yeah,
you were talking about Wiltshire. First of all, the first stone placements at Stonehenge are a match for the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney. Mm. The second thing is that nearby, a house from that era existed that was a match for one of the Skara Break houses like this one, right down to the placement of the furnishings.
Perfect.
So it became a pattern for houses of that era all around the United Kingdom. Mm. But what it demonstrates is, along with a bunch of other evidence, that whoever made those first stone placements at Stonehenge had been imported from Orkney, was somebody who had megalithic stoneworking skills and had stayed there long enough to build themselves a house and oversee the placement of the stones.
As you'll see at the end in a reconstruction, these were covered, with natural elements, hides, etc. And I'm sure in their time very cozy and snug. But as you walk through this area, you are, the resourcefulness of these individual folks. What we're seeing here are storage areas, sleeping areas, cooking areas, each one as sensibly laid out and as logical as it can be. And again, you can also sense there is this community. These things are all interconnected by these walkways. And as you see, very close to the sea.
It is now. Back in the day, it's thought that it was a little further removed from the Bay of Skara there.
Yeah. This gives you a sense of how intimate it would be if covered. And original stone furniture. I love that. Now we are in Maze How, which on the exterior looks like a hill. It is a manufactured hill. Okay, again, Skara Break, and
this is the Bay of Scale next to Skara Break.
Yeah, we will come back to that in a moment. Just want to see.
Right. Now, this is an important slide I think we should talk about.
Yep.
Okay. In Neolithic times at 3200 BC and after, from about 3400 BC to around 2600 BC, Neil Oliver, who was a BBC commentator, did a documentary on Skara Break back in 2000. It played in 2017. We crossed paths with him a number of times in 2016. Mm-hmm. And he happened to cite one of my observations. It's nobody else's, but it's one of mine. But he happened to cite it without crediting it. It's that the original plan of the houses at Skara Break all represented the body of a sleeping woman or a sleeping goddess. That's a cosmological theme. Okay, someone on Orkney in Neolithic times was conducting instruction on the energy concepts that we've been talking about in terms of Three-Eye Atlas on a human scale. They had recreated the structures that characterize these energies, in the atomic scale. They had recreated them on a human scale, and the key to that are the mountains on the left. Those mountains are visible as sort of a showcase in front of the standing stones of Stennis, which are the oldest standing stones in Britain. And they're important because I had mentioned that Louis de Broglie talked in 1927 about the two energies that govern a hydrogen atom. What someone set up, because of the way the geometry works on Orkney, is a human scale recreation of how those energies work. Two energies. One energy is linear. It's represented by the motion of the sun from sunrise to sunset, setting behind these mountains. The other energy oscillates the same way that the sun does throughout the year, as in the seasonal motions of the sun. A person standing here could watch the sun over the course of days and months progressively move north and then south again this is an equinox picture, and then south further to the next solstice. Okay, so those dynamics of energy were at the forefront of education on Orkney. It was not by accident, because all of the other structures pertain to the same concepts.
Yes.
Now, several hundred years later, in ancient Egypt, when a site was established, you have to go back to the previous slide again, the sunset slides. When the site of Abydos in Egypt was established during the early dynastic Egypt, according to Seti, who was an authority on Abydos, its original name, Abdu, meant the desired mountain. Someone had deliberately chosen the site because the mountains from Abydos do exactly the same thing as what they do on Orkney. And the site was honorific of Orkney. And so I present this slide, which is the equinox sunset from both locations, as one of the evidences that has to be true. So the whole reason I started writing about Orkney was because a person I didn't know emailed me from Australia asking if I thought I saw ancient Egyptian influences on Orkney. And I thought, well, that's too early for Egypt to have mounted an expedition to Orkney, so I don't think so. But I explored it anyway and discovered that, in fact, that was exactly the reverse of what happened. What we were seeing was Orkney influences on Egypt, as we can also trace on every other major esoteric tradition that happened after 3200 BC. We have those influences on Minoan Crete. We have them on ancient Greece. We have them on Hinduism and Buddhism. We have them on traditions in North America. We have them after 2600 BC in South America. And my book sort of moved geographically, and each time sort of focusing on how those same signature aspects of the Orkney tradition play out in all these locations. It's not by accident. The reason that Jung found archetypes everywhere was the same reason as if, let's imagine that a person who was in their 50s right now happened to have the same math teacher in high school that I had when I was in high school. And we met at a cocktail party and we started talking about, oh, gee, we realized we had the same math teacher. Interesting that we both know the same little tricks for, little formulas to make calculating numbers easy, and the same little geometric proofs and so forth. Not because one of us taught it to the other person, but because we had the same teacher a long time ago. That's how we explain the archetypes of all these traditions. They all shared instruction in the same tradition in the archaic times. And the Dogon and the Buddhists are the ones who primarily preserve the knowledge of that, and we can cross compare what they tell us about it and understand what happened.
So is it fair to say that the civilization back then, before the glories of ancient Egypt, was a seagoing civilization advanced enough to make their way to these other locations in Africa and the North Africa? That what was going on in the Orkney Islands?
Well, let's start off. The first evidence we have of this tradition is at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Virtually every symbolic element that we see at Göbekli Tepe is an alternate way of expressing the idea of these two Samkhya energies coming together to create, to promote the creation of all the created things. You can express it, even the concept of a sanctuary itself in ancient times it was defined as the place where those two energies came together. The shape of the oval enclosures that are found buried at Göbekli Tepe are the shape of a beat frequency, which are the same energetics as a warp bubble. Part of the reason I recognize all the warp bubble stuff is because I've been studying these same energetics on different scales for 3 decades. Once I realized what I was looking at, it was perfect. I could predict what was going to be true about the warp bubble because it's the same energetics. All I have to do is I know if it's true about a beat frequency, it's true about a warp bubble. Easy peasy.
Again, besides some of the most remarkable stone circles or stone procession ways, like the Cross of Callanish, which is set on a north axis, and it's a double row of stones opening up into, from the air, it looks like a Christian cross, but of course predates Christianity.
Right.
And there is no place with a higher concentration of these. And boy, the amount of work and high intention that was going on there back before the pyramids is simply mind-blowing to me. And the pyramids, we're moving around a bit here, but your exploration of this subject, can you tell us what the Great Pyramid Hoax is briefly and why you wrote this book? It's a very important book as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Actually, the book is not mine. It's Scott Creighton's. I wrote the foreword for this book, but I do know a fair amount about the pyramids. But to get at what the pyramid's about, you need a little bit of background. We're talking about these two energies, magnetism and electricity. Their natural mode is to oscillate with each other, to move back and forth. And they oscillate between two resting states. In those resting states, they take turns being the dominant energy. So we're moving from a state where magnetism is dormant, but electricity is unimpeded, to one where the opposite is true, where magnetism is dominant and electricity is dormant. That defines a continuum of energy, what I call a continuum. And Louis de Broglie diagrammed that continuum. That continuum is shaped like the Egyptian mouth glyph. It's like the shape of an almond. It's pointed at the ends and larger in the middle. It's like Monty Python's Brontosaurus. Very small at one end, much, much larger in the middle, and very small at the other end again. Okay, now, according to the Dogon, that continuum of energy naturally self-differentiates into subsections. And what you can compare that to is what happens with deep seawater in the ocean. When you have a very deep, like a deep trench in the oceans, what happens is that separate biological zones self-differentiate. as you go down in the water, to the point where the types of life forms that you find living comfortably along the bottom of the ocean are very different from the ones that are prefer to be at the top swimming along the surface.
And that is the point that we're going to come back to when we return from this brief break. Those life forms at the bottom of the ocean. Back in a minute. Peter Robbins, Laird Scranton, Meanwhile Here on Earth. Or not. And those brief life forms at the bottom of the ocean that we were talking about compared to the top.
Okay, so you understand that the life forms shift all the way up, depending on what depth you're at. You see different things. The Dogons say that the exact same thing is true about these domains of energy. That it sounds like we're getting
phone message in the other room.
Oh, okay, so Dogons say the exact same thing happens with this continuum of energy, that in each of the 14, they say there are 14 domains of energy. We know that they're scientifically correct because we see those same 14 domains in a hydrogen atom because of what's called the Zeeman effect, that there are only 5 energy levels, but when an electron moves through a hydrogen atom, it has to pass through 14 specific orbital paths. They were documented by a physicist named George Gamma. He's a British physicist. And the electron, as it moves through those domains, has to do it in order. It can't just jump from the top energy level to the bottom one. If it wants to move to a lower energy level, it has to pass through all of the subdomains in that energy level before it can move to the next energy level. So it's as if the electron, as it's moving around the hydrogen atom, is binding together those domains of energy into a coherent structure. Now, the electron speeds up as it passes through those domains, but not because of regular velocity. Einstein said, if I'm driving in a car and I speed up, certain things happen. The faster I go, the more massive I become. And the pace of time slows down as I speed up. And a bunch of other things happen because of relativistic effects as with regular acceleration. But the electron passing through the hydrogen atom doesn't suffer those effects. Why not? Because it's moving under the same energetics as a warp bubble, as a ship in a warp bubble that doesn't move. It's the bubble that moves. And the implication is it's not the electron that's moving, it's the space that it's passing through that's moving. There are lots of important different inferences we can make because of the way the ancient system tells us the energies work. So in those domains of energy that we're talking about within this continuum, in my estimation, that's where the forms of life that we're interfacing with, that we think of as UFOs, come from. Imagine you're a fish swimming just below the surface of the water and a boat passes over the top. What is the fish going to see that is any different than from what we see when a UFO appears? It's the same effect. We're seeing a sort of a one-dimensional version of what's really going on. The fish might not realize that it's a boat passing over, but they would see this thing suddenly appear that had a certain shape that was moving in ways a fish can't possibly move. It's the same effect. Now, beyond that, I've looked at most of the thousands of cases that were documented by your colleague, Bud Hopkins, and by John Mack, where they interviewed individuals, typically individuals who had contact experiences with UFOs. And the things that those people report represent the same symbolic forms that I write about in ancient studies. They're the same symbolic forms that appear in vivid dreams. And so they're the same symbolic forms that appear in the ancient languages I write about. As a matter of fact, in your typical vivid dream, there will be a handful of elements of the dream. Certain images the person remembers seeing, certain sounds they might have heard, certain actions that might have taken place, certain words that might have been spoken, and so forth. They might get the name of somebody who's in the dream. All of those values tend to play out in terms of a single phonetic value. If I go to an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, I can find the place in the dictionary where that phonetic value is expressed, and I'll find all of those elements of their dream represented in those words. And typically I'll find one other word that's not in the dream that expresses to me what the dream was actually about. Here's the concept that the dream was actually trying to get to. This is a coherent system of symbolic elements. It has meaning. That if you look at a word like we talked about, that word aku, the reason I'm able to read that word for you is because there are certain, in these symbolic languages, there are certain words whose purpose it is to assign meanings to individual glyphs. In Egyptian hieroglyphic language, we pick one of those words, and at the end of the word, there's a glyph that's not typically unpronounced. One of the ways it's what I call a defining word. We substitute concepts for the glyphs, and it produces a sentence that tells us what meaning we want to assign to that trailing glyph. That now becomes one of the meanings of the glyph. Knowing that, I can now lay out the meanings of literally hundreds of ancient Egyptian glyphs on the authority of the language itself, not because I guessed it, not because some Egyptologist thought it might represent that. Sir E.A. Wallace Budge manages to get a lot of those meanings right in his hieroglyphic dictionary. But even when he doesn't get it right, even if he thinks it represents a baseball bat when it represents something entirely different, I can go to the word for baseball bat, look at the glyphs, and find out what it really represents. Because he intuitively understands that those words where the trailing glyphs are is where the meaning is assigned.
Laird, one of the great heresies of antiquarian scholarship, in the formal sense, is, again, even suggesting that the pyramids were the result of being built by individuals, a culture, if you will, that predates that state that we call ancient Egypt. Right. Is that something you subscribe to? And if so, why?
Again, that's complicated. Well, let's get back to the pyramid, which is where we were trying to get in the first place here. The pyramid produces energetics that resonate with each of these domains of energy I was talking about. So I'm convinced that at least on one level, one of the purposes of the pyramid was to hold open contact among those levels. Those orbs we're looking at, the Aku orbs in Dogon society, the primary role of those Aku orbs is as messengers to communicate between the 14 domains of energy, between a primordial consciousness that is not deified and the other domains of energy that are also not deified. In Hinduism, 5 of those domains of energy actively participate in individualized consciousness like yours or mine. The role of the Aku orbs is to communicate among the domains of energy. That's its primary role. I believe that at the middle of this energetic cycle, we're dealing with a cycle where energies are shifting. They're shifting the same way sand shifts in an hourglass. If you think of the sand all begins in the top hourglass and it slowly sifts down into the bottom hourglass. If you think of these domains are time differentiated. There's a change in the pace of time between the domains. So when we start out, the original domain is moving at an incredibly fast time frame, and the lower one, the one with all the sand is moving at a slow time frame. The one that's moved with none of the sand is moving at a very quick time frame. But halfway through the cycle, the sand equalizes, which means the time frames equalize. Now it works like water pressure, that it becomes possible to move between the domains without bad effects. Just like if we go into an airlock in a submarine, we can move out into the water because we equalize the pressure first. In outer space, if we equalize the pressure with an airlock, we can move out into space safely and back into the spaceship. At the middle of our cycle, which hits about 3600 BC, suddenly it becomes possible for consciousness, these energetic consciousnesses, to move into our domain. That's what the Dogons say happened, that one of those Aku orbs, or a class of those Aku orbs, were able to move into our domain and take on materialized form and interact with us one-on-one and teach us things. That's the outlook. As unbelievable as it sounds, that's an outlook that's upheld in any number of other traditions. That's why these other traditions have words for the Aku orbs that match match phonetically or match conceptually with the Dogon. The Hindu word is the Dogon word. The Buddhist word is, or the Hindu word is Diva. The Dogon word is Ogo. The Egyptian word is Aku, and there are other cultures that also have words for these energetic orbs.
Laird,
notice when the orbs appeared over New Jersey, somebody in authority sent up every man-made device known, the drones, to distract our attention from the energetic orbs, which were the real story. And they managed to shift the media perception so that now every time one of those energetic orbs appears, the media says drone, 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 not energetic orb. But the story is the energetic orb, just the same as with 3i Atlas. The story is what looks like the energetic orb.
how old do you theorize the Great Pyramid is?
I can tell you generally, whoever put the symbolic system together was OCD focused on it. They bent over backwards to make sure they adhered to it. It's like Judaism, where in an Orthodox temple, they still insist that the women sit separately from the men. Why is that? Because that's symbolic of the way the energy works. It's feminine energy, it's masculine energy. If they relent with that, they're not representing the energies right anymore. They're lying to us about the energy. The synagogue that you sit in represents the womb of the sleeping goddess. At Beth El in Israel, they won't even let women see the temple, the original temple that was there, because it's shaped like a sleeping goddess, and the womb of that sleeping goddess is the room in which the practitioners were praying, the sanctuary. So, to answer your question, one of the symbolic elements was the shape of architectural forms. Before the middle of the cycle, architectural forms typically had a round base and rose from that. If you go to the earliest structures on in the Near East and off the coast in Cyprus and places like that, they all have round bases. Suddenly, starting about the era of Skara Break, the structures began to be built with square bases. So we can tell which half of the energetic half cycle a structure was built in based on whether it has a round base or a square base. The pyramids have a square base. That implies to me they were built in the second half of an energetic half cycle. If they were built in our half cycle, that means they were built after 3600 BC, unquestionably. John Anthony West, who was my mentor and friend, allowed that their construction might go back to a previous half cycle. But if they did, then they were built in the second half of that half cycle, not the first half.
And about how old would that make them?
Well, it would make them another 6,000 years older than 12,000 BC. So they would have to be sometime after 18,000 BC if they happened in the previous cycle. But the pyramids are so endurable, so durable, that they might go farther back than that conceivably. The Sphinx, on the other hand, the Sphinx is characteristic of how symbolism was carried out about the time of Göbekli Tepe. There's a feminist group, a matriarchal group that emerged in the Near East about that same time, who had the habit of carving animal figures out of natural outcroppings of stone. And that's what the Sphinx is. So it says to me that around 10,000 BC is when it was carved, and it probably reflects the practices of that tradition.
I wanted to share something with you, a lighthearted observation about a serious topic. At one point, and I'm trying to remember the context, but it was talking about basically John Anthony West's estimates of the age, potentially, of the Great Pyramid, which, if he was correct, predated the beginnings of Judaism, certainly one of the oldest religions.
Right.
And as a Jewish person, I'm sensitive to and interested in people who point to or claim that somebody has acted in an anti-Semitic way.
Right.
And it was an outraged complaint that, as you know, at Passover, there is a dinner that is highly symbolic.
Right.
And one of the things that we learn as children is that the Jewish people, as slaves, built the pyramids. We have the salt water, which reminds us of our tears and all that. This person was furious because if West was right, or his theories were taken seriously, it meant that the Jews didn't build the pyramid, and that's kind of anti-Semitic in terms of, hey, we got bragging rights on that. For real.
Yeah.
So I just thought I would put that in there because it's absurd in the extreme.
One of the ancient Egyptian words that relates to the word Hebrew is aprio. It is a word that defines the concept of an apron, which is the concept that lies behind a Jewish tallis. But it also pertains to a group of stonecutters, stonemasons, who worked. They were instrumental at a site called Gebel El Silsila in Egypt. It's situated near Aswan, south of where Giza is, quite a distance. Two of your very good friends, have exclusive excavation rights to that site. One of them just recently passed away. His name's John Ward. Maria Nilsson is a spectacular woman from Scandinavia, who is the youngest woman ever to be granted 40-year exclusive rights to a major Egyptian excavation site. That stone quarry had been in use continuously since the end of the Ice Age, and until she began work on it, had never been excavated. Her team produces finds every year that are highlighted in Archaeology magazine and all sorts of other archaeological publications around the world. She's a really, as I said, spectacular person. She gives the impression of a Disney princess, but more so what one of the conferences we were at during the conference break, she and her husband, John Ward, and Risa and I went out to try to find lunch in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is a difficult thing to do because none of the retail outlets are at street level because of the way snow happens there. You have to go up into the buildings to find retail. So we walked across the city park, and we had to stop midway across the park because all of the woodland creatures came scampering up to her as they would in a Disney cartoon to hang out with her. In Silsila, she's been befriended by white owls.
Oh. We miss John, who passed earlier, well, actually, just a few months ago. a very dedicated and wonderfully colorful Egyptologist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your passion for the studies that have drawn you from one area of related study in the antiquarian world to the next have given you an opportunity to visit locations that you would have never otherwise visited. Some on your own, some with your son, some with Risa. And I'm curious to know, as an inveterate traveler, which locations that you've had reason to visit has been the one that you've wanted to return to the most, if you can quantify it into one.
Yes, well, actually, I've always said, okay, because of the work I did as a software designer, an independent software designer for about 200 companies, I wasn't really free to travel very much. I not even free to take a week-long vacation. And what I would do instead is I would plan a 3-day weekend around a federal holiday, take an extra day off, and count those 4 days as vacation. So I wasn't really in a position to travel. I always said that when I had a compelling reason to go someplace, I would. And the place that I ultimately had the compelling reason to go to was Orkney. Now, the trips that I took to Orkney, just by circumstance, ended up also bringing me to Stonehenge and to Avebury.
Yeah.
Where there happened to be abiding connections to Orkney. I didn't know it at the time. And to London, where there are also some abiding connections. And so Orkney, by far and away, is the compelling place to go. There are some other localities around Orkney that are also every bit as compelling.
And in fact, we kind of brushed over them. I want to bring us back to an extraordinary location on Orkney, which we have both visited, Maze How. And it is, if you were to look at it on the horizon, it's a hill, but it is a manufactured hill. And I believe it was in the 8th or 9th century, Vikings broke into it from the top, assuming that there would be treasure, or maybe it was a burial area and people were buried with jewelry or whatever.
Actually, what happened was they were surprised by a major snowstorm and they needed shelter and they had no place to go. 100 of them. And so what they did was they broke in from the top and crammed 100 Vikings into this tiny space.
Wow.
And to entertain themselves, they were carving these runic inscriptions in the stone walls.
Yes.
And they would carve such things as, "The treasure you seek was removed 3 days ago."
It's wonderful when humor can span the centuries and still be funny.
Yeah. You're right about Ingeborg. There are lots of commentary about what a stunning specimen of a woman.
A very special woman she was to apparently a number of the Vikings, as my visit to the Stromness Historical Society bore out.
Right. Now, there's an interesting thing here in this photograph that you're showing of Maze How. Okay, you notice that in the corners, we have what look like pillars. Actually, they very strongly resemble the same pillars that we see at the nearby standing stones of Stennis, which had 12 slots for stones.
Yes.
My perspective is that Orkney was a training ground for initiates. The Dogons say that 8 initiates were selected and each locality brought to a remote location, which I take to be Orkney, and given instruction and then returned back to their original homes to pass that instruction on to their contemporaries. Okay, now Skara Break gives the appearance of dormitory housing for those 8 initiates and or their families. There were 8 chambers at Skara Break. So it looks to me as if each class of initiates was taken through the entire megalithic stoneworking process. They would go to one of the beach areas on Orkney and leverage up a piece of sandstone there, which naturally comes up in pieces that look like these pillars. They would use seaweed as a lubricant, and which Neil Oliver determined and demonstrated was possible. They were able to slide those pillars all the way to where the standing stone of Stennis are, which is several miles. Each class would then erect one of those stones as part of the circle. But the problem is that after 12 classes, all the slots were full. And so my guess is what happened was they had to decommission one of the stones before they could do this. And so they would extract one of those stones, and now they had to do something with the stone. They had a stone they didn't know what to do with. And so there are several places nearby the standing stone of Stennis where there are similarly shaped stones. One of those is the interior of Maze Howe. Those stones we saw in the picture are not weight bearing. They were placed there after the fact. And so basically they stowed those extra stones away.
Yeah. Wild.
Now, another thing that happened was one of my books is called Tracing Orkney's Origins. Right. Basically, what it does is it uses a number of collective sets of symbols and traces their movement from the Near East to Orkney over the course of thousands of years, across from a major island across the Mediterranean, then out Madagascar, up the coast through the Hebrides to Orkney, and demonstrates that that's where it all come from. All of the founding elements on Orkney at sometime after 4000 BC were found in similar form in that same era on Malta, including the concept of the sleeping goddess, which is what the houses on Orkney represent.
Yeah.
Also, you were talking about the Christian cross. I have photographs that demonstrate the point at which it looks as if that shape of the sleeping goddess with her two arms transforms itself into the Christian cross in the Hebrides, at a site in the Hebrides sometime after 2600 BC. It's the same tradition. On Orkney in Kirkwall, the Emperor's Palace in Kirkwall takes the same shape of that sleeping goddess. When you go to Abydos, the earliest burial chambers at Abydos for the earliest pharaohs of Egypt, including Narmer, take the same shape of that sleeping goddess house. They recreate what the Dogon called the main house shape, and they sit in view of those same mountains where the sun sets on the equinox between the mountains. That's where the cemetery was placed. There are a series of honorific elements at Abydos that say Orkney, 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 Orkney.
Fascinating. Is there an ancient mystery that stays in your mind, or that you think about, or that you've researched, that you're stymied about, that you would love to know more about or have the answer to?
Yes, when I had written my first book and it caught the attention of John Anthony West, which is a very fortuitous thing for me, I had sent out targeted emails and one of them caught his attention. He wanted to read the book, but unlike a zillion other offers, I had not offered to give him one. So he phoned me when he got back to the United States. He lived within about 45 minutes drive of me. He phoned me and kept me on the phone until I offered to send him a book. So shortly after that, one of his fans contacted me wanting to meet in New York City to talk about the book. So we arranged to go to a diner in New York. My adult son was living in the city at that time, so he joined us. My wife, Risa, joined us. We took the train down from Albany. And at the last minute, this guy asked if he could bring a friend. And I said, sure. Turns out the meeting wasn't with the guy. It was with the quote-unquote friend. And she wasn't a friend. She was his spiritual advisor. And the purpose of the meeting was, it was an interview with me. It consisted of her asking me a series of questions that I would then respond to. They were questions personal to me that I would then respond to, and she would point out to me how my response tied back to the symbolic tradition that I was writing about.
Laird, I realize I've asked a question with not enough time to be answered. You and I could go at this for every Monday for a year, I'm sure.
To make a long story short, the final question was, who did I think was responsible for this system of symbols that I was researching? I said, I didn't know who, but I knew enough to know that what would eventually tell me who. And she said, did you just say what will tell me who? And I said, yeah. And she said, we're done. And she got up and she left.
Wow. Laird Scranton, thank you so much as always. In real time, it's Monday. This coming Thursday is Thanksgiving. I know from Laird's family and my own, we wish you a very happy Thanksgiving. But to remember, this can be a particularly difficult time of year for folks. So be extra kind. Have a wonderful time, I hope, with your family. Stay well, fight for what you believe in, and I'll see you next week at this time.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.